If you want to become a pilot, the FAA requires you to know which documents must be on board the aircraft anytime you go fly. And in this video, I'm going to explain those in detail. Welcome to Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh, and today we're talking about required documents. And they don't call them required for no reason. These are required by the Federal Aviation Regulations. In fact, this is the first episode in our discussion on the Federal Aviation Regulations. And as we're going through today's lesson, you're going to notice that when we discuss some of these requirements, I'll throw a reference like this on the screen. It's really important that you look these up in the FAR AIM when you get a chance. And frankly, these are some of the ones I would bookmark for the check ride. To get started, let's take a quick look at the 3 documents that every pilot needs to have in their possession when they fly an aircraft or when they act as a required crew member. You'll find the details of this requirement in FAR 61.3, but if you want to fly or act as a required crew member, you have to have these 3 things in your possession. First, you got to have your pilot certificate. Then you have to have a valid photo ID. And I know this sounds kind of stupid since the PPL or the sport pilot license should count as an ID, but they don't put your picture on it because it doesn't ever expire. And if you don't get any more ratings or certificates, you're stuck with that same card. Anyway, what constitutes a valid photo ID? Well, it can be any of these things right here. A state-issued driver's license, and if you're unlucky enough to live in Washington, D.C. or one of the U.S. territories, your license counts as well. A government ID is fine as well. It can be a federal or state-issued ID card. Then, for my military brothers out there, your military ID card or your CAC card works fine too. You can also use your passport or an airport security ID as long as it gives you unescorted access to security identification display areas, whatever that means. In addition to these, you can also use any other form of identification that the administrator finds acceptable. And who in the world knows what this means? But if you don't have one of these that we just talked about, you can call your local FSDO office and see if what you have is acceptable to them. Yeah, I was wondering if I could use my Costco card as a valid ID. Well, why not? It's got my picture on it. Last but not least, you have to have a current medical certificate. Now, sport pilots don't have to have one of these, but most other pilots do. And it also needs to be the right type of medical certificate for the type of flying that you're going to be doing. I'll go into more detail on this in a minute, but for now, just know that you have to have a current medical unless you're going for a sport pilot rating. This brings up an important point. If you're just starting to work on your private pilot certificate, you have to have that medical certificate before you can go fly solo. So it's a good idea to get that scheduled as soon as possible. Waiting until the last minute can significantly delay your training, so get that done, or else. Now, the only time you don't need a medical certificate as a private pilot is if you're operating under Basic Med. I'll go into a little bit more detail on Basic Med in a future episode. There's quite a bit to know about that. But if you're not operating under Basic Med and you're not a sport pilot, you have to have all 3 of these in your physical possession, or they must be readily accessible in the aircraft anytime you go fly. And by the way, with the new Mosaic rule, if you have a sport pilot rating, you can get an endorsement to fly at night. But in order to operate under these privileges, in this case, you will also have to have your medical or your Basic Med paperwork in this situation. And if someone asks you for this paperwork, you're going to be really sad if you accidentally left it in your mom's basement. And that brings up a good point. Who can ask me for these papers? What are they going to do? Pull me over in the air? I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, and I can't tell you how dumb people sound when they say that. Because there are a handful of people that can ask you for these documents, and if you don't produce them when they ask for them, you can get in a lot of trouble. In fact, here's a list of all the people that can ask you for these documents. All these guys right here have the right to ask for your stuff. Don't think it just has to be the FAA. It doesn't. Who am I kidding? You guys are probably always going to carry your pilot credentials on you. You never know when you might be on a Delta flight and the pilot dies of a heart attack. Excuse me, ma'am. I just want to let you know I'm a private pilot and I'm going to be seated in seat 24B in case you guys need me. All right, let's go into some more detail on these medical certificates because you need to make sure you have the right type. And you also need to make sure that it's not expired. Here are the 4 types of medical certificates available. You'll find all this information in FAR 6123, but don't worry, Uncle Josh is going to break it down Barney style for you. Now, the main difference in all these certificates is the type of exam that the doctor has to perform and how long the certificate lasts. In order to get your private pilot's license, you're going to need a third-class medical certificate. And once again, if you're a sport pilot, getting the third-class medical may allow you to fly at night under the new Mosaic rule, but you still need to meet the training requirements after you get that. First and second medicals are really for commercial pilots, and there's a little bit more to the exam, but you only need a third class if you're going for your PPL. Then once again, there's basic med. But in order to earn your private pilot's license, you have to pass one of these other three first before you can use basic med. And then there's some limitations if you do decide to use it. Now, even though you're probably only going for your third class medical, let's talk about these other two really quick because you might decide that you want to make flying a career. First class medical exams are mainly for airline transport pilots who want to operate as the pilot in command. In other words, these would be the captain of an airliner. These guys need a first class medical certificate. These certificates don't last very long, and that's because the FAA wants them to get looked at by a doctor more regularly than someone like you who's only flying their Cessna 172 30 miles to get a $100 hamburger. For pilots under the age of 40, first class medicals only last 12 calendar months. If you're 40 and over, they only last 6 months. Now, one important thing to keep in mind about these things is that when they expire, they aren't completely worthless anymore. For pilots with the first class medical 40 and up, when their first class expires, it turns into a second class for 6 more months, then it drops to a third class. If you're below 40, when the 12 months are up, it automatically turns into a third class medical certificate. So you can still fly, you just can't do certain things. Now notice how this says calendar months. That just means that it expires the last day of the month, 12 months from this date. In other words, if I got my first class medical on January 15th of last year, my first class is going to expire on January 31st of the next year. Then, like we said, it's not completely expired at that point. Now it's a third class medical. Keep in mind, a lot of aviation timelines are tracked in calendar months. So this is something you want to be familiar with. We'll be discussing this more in a future video. Next, we have the second class medical certificate. In a nutshell, this is what you need for most other commercial flying jobs out there. And this one lasts 12 calendar months no matter what age you are. Then, once it expires, it reverts to a third class medical certificate. And this is something good to keep in mind because if you're interested in aviation as a career, you might consider going ahead and getting a second class medical right off the bat to make sure you can pass the exam. It's nice to know that you can pass it without any issues before you spend thousands of dollars on training. They don't usually cost much more, and they always revert to a third class when they expire. And oddly enough, if you want to be a flight instructor, you only need a third class medical to do that. So if you don't have aspirations to go into the airlines or any other type of commercial stuff, but you want to teach, you only have to have your third class medical to do that. And the aviation community can always use instructors who actually enjoy teaching. Now, I do want to mention that as someone pointed out in the older version of this video, technically the first and second class medicals don't revert to a lower certificate. Yes, they are still technically first and second class medical certificates, but the privileges you can operate under are exactly the same as the lesser medical. I'm just explaining this in the easiest way possible for people to understand. If you want more details on that, check out this chart in FAR 6123. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the third class medical because this is the one that you have to have before you go solo if you're going for your private pilot certificate. And you also have to have it to operate legally as a private pilot. And also, if you want to fly at night as a sport pilot, you can also get the third class medical, and this can allow you to do that if you take the proper training. The main thing you need to know about the third class medical certificate is how long it lasts before it expires. And this depends on your age. If you're less than 40, your third class medical lasts 60 calendar months. And if you're bad at math, that's 5 years. If you're 40 years and older, your third class only lasts 24 calendar months or 2 years. And remember, those are calendar months. So it expires on the last day of the month. So if you're less than 40, you're good for 5 years. If you're 40 and up, you only have 2 years before you have to get your certificate renewed. Really quickly, let's look at how they might ask you a question about this on the written exam. You might even get asked about this on your check ride. Let's say you have a first class medical certificate that was issued on November 11th and you're 20 years old. When does this medical expire? Well, a first class medical lasts 12 months if you're below 40. So this one expires next year on the 30th of November. Then you could only use it for third class privileges. What if I was 55 years old and I had a second class medical certificate that was issued on May 14th? When would that one expire? Well, everyone expires at 12 calendar months with the second class. So that one would expire on May 31st next year. All right, here's a tricky one. Let's say I'm 39 years old and I got my third class medical issued on July 4th. When does this one expire? Well, I'm below 40, so it would expire on July 31st, 5 years from now, because that's 60 calendar months. So the important thing to remember is that the expiration date of a medical certificate depends on your age. And once again, there's a handy little chart in FAR 6123 that works really well as a quick reference if you ever need a quick reminder. One thing to remember about these medical exams is that they have to be done by a specific doctor that have been designated by the FAA. And these doctors are called aviation medical examiners, or AMEs. And you can find a list of all the AMEs in your area on the FAA's website. All right, here we are on www.faa.gov. I'll just move down here to pilots and airmen, then click on medical certification. Then I'll click this button that says locate an AME. Then I'll just click this link that says search for an aviation medical examiner AME in your area. Now you can just search the AMEs in your area and hopefully you can find a good one. Okay, we've talked about the three things you have to have in your possession to be able to go fly an aircraft. Now let's take a closer look at your pilot certificate, because your pilot certificate has to say certain things on the back of it before you can go fly certain types of aircraft. To make this easier to understand, let's take a quick step back and talk about a few things. In order to understand what you can and can't fly, you first need to understand how we group the different kinds of aircraft. And the way we do this is by category and class. When I'm talking about aircraft, I'm basically talking about anything that flies and can hold a person. Yeah, I know a drone is an aircraft, but it's an unmanned aircraft, and those fall into a separate group. Today we're talking about manned aircraft, and the FAA says that there are 7 main categories that you can get certified to fly. For most of you watching this video, you are probably going to get your license to fly a powered fixed-wing aircraft. And that's what we call an airplane, in case you didn't know that. Then, if you want to go fly helicopters or gyroplanes, you would need to have a rotorcraft category on the back of your license. Keep in mind, for those of you going for your sport pilot certificate, your license is not going to have a category or a class on the back of it. When you pass your check ride, the FAA will send you an endorsement that you can put in your logbook with the category and class that you're allowed to fly. And if you want to get an added category or class, you have to take some training with an approved instructor. And then when he thinks you're ready, he can give you a new endorsement that allows you to fly that aircraft. Let's go back to talking about categories. A glider is another type of fixed wing aircraft, but this one doesn't have an engine. Then, if you wanted to fly a balloon as a private pilot, you need your license to show this lighter than air category on the back. Then we have the weight shift control aircraft. A hang glider falls into this category. Then we have the powered parachute. Then last but not least, we have the powered lift category, which would be like an Osprey or a Harrier or something like that. I doubt anyone here is trying to get that category rating, but you never know. Anyway, the big thing to know about this is that once you get your private pilot or sport pilot certificate, you can only fly aircraft in the same category that you are rated for. For example, if my license says airplane on the back, I can't just go jump into a rotorcraft without getting some training from an instructor and take a check ride. Now, one cool thing about the sport pilot rating is once you have your sport pilot certificate, you technically do not have to take another check ride. You just have to get training from an approved instructor and then get endorsed by that instructor to be able to fly those kinds of aircraft, which is kind of crazy considering the FAA is actually opening up some types of helicopters to you guys under the new Mosaic rule. But anyway, from here, each category is further divided into separate classes. For example, in the airplane category, we've got 4 main classes you can get your certification on. These classes include single-engine land, single-engine sea, multi-engine land, and multi-engine sea. Now, these classes exist for a reason. The way you land a multi-engine land airplane is significantly different than the way you land a single-engine sea airplane. So much so that the FAA has decided that you need to get specific training for these different airplanes and take a check ride. So, if your license doesn't have a certain category or a specific class of aircraft on it, you can't just jump in and take off. And once again, for you sport pilots, you guys have to have an endorsement. Now, for you helicopter nerds out there, you basically have two classes of rotorcraft. You've got the helicopter and a gyroplane. So if you've got your helicopter license, you're going to have to get some training before you can just jump into a gyroplane. I don't know why anyone would want that many moving parts directly over their head, but if that's what does it for you, go for it. Okay, so we've got the main group of flying thingies, and this is what we call aircraft. Then below that, we've got seven main categories. And then those are further divided into different classes. Then we can divide those up even more into types. And these are basically the exact make and model of your aircraft. An example of a type would be a Cessna 172, or a Piper Cherokee 140, or a de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver. And with that in mind, there are actually certain types of aircraft that you need a special rating to fly. We call these type ratings. Basically, if an airplane has a max gross weight takeoff more than 12,500 pounds, or it has turbojet engines on it, you have to get special training and take a check ride before you can go fly it. But here's something kind of interesting. You have to have a type rating if the airplane has a turbojet on it, but you don't have to have one for a turboprop airplane. The only exception is if that airplane is over 12,500 pounds. Then in that case, you've got to have a type rating like this one right here. According to this guy's certificate, he's type rated to fly the Beechcraft 400. Okay, we just talked about all the paperwork you have to have on board for you, the pilot. Now let's talk about all the paperwork you have to have on board the aircraft for the aircraft itself. Before we do, though, I want to take a minute to talk about the different categories of aircraft. And I know this might seem a little confusing since we just talked about aircraft categories, but those categories were for the purpose of a pilot certification. These categories are specifically referring to how an aircraft is certified, and they categorize airplanes based on how they're going to be used. You can also call these operating categories. When it comes to aircraft certification categories, there are five standard kinds, but you only need to be familiar with three of them as a private pilot or a sport pilot. These are the normal, utility, and acrobatic category. Right about now, you're probably thinking, this sounds kind of familiar, and you'd be right because we talked a little bit about normal and utility categories in my video on weight and balance. But the one we didn't discuss was the acrobatic category. Anyway, when an aircraft is certified, it has to meet certain criteria before it can be certified in one of these categories. For example, the normal category allows aircraft to be used for normal everyday flying, and it has to be able to do certain things in order to be certified in that category. For an aircraft to be certified in the utility category, it has to meet a few more requirements because this category allows you to do some additional maneuvers that the normal category doesn't allow. For example, this Cessna 172 Sierra is certified in the utility category, so I could do spins if I wanted as long as I stayed inside the weight and CG limits for the utility category. Acrobatic aircraft, on the other hand, are specifically made for aerobatics, so these have to be even tougher and meet more rigorous criteria. But as long as it meets these specifications and the FAA has full faith that the wings aren't going to break off when you do a barrel roll, then that's when it can get certified as an acrobatic aircraft. Okay, before we move on, let's briefly look at a couple more categories. These are special airworthiness certification categories, and you should at least have a general knowledge of a couple of these. The experimental category is an important one for you to remember because this is the category that home-built aircraft fall under. Now, the big gotcha with these is that there are quite a few restrictions when it comes to experimental aircraft. For example, you can't carry people or stuff for hire, and you also can't operate them over congested airways and over densely populated areas. I could go on for quite a while, but you'll find a complete list of these in FAR 91-319. If you're hoping to build your own airplane like I am one day, you'll want to write that down for future reference. Next, we have the light sport. These are basically sport aircraft that don't really fit into the home-built, ultralight, or gyroplane category. Under the new Mosaic rule, an aircraft can be certified under the light sport category as long as it has a stall speed of 61 knots or less, 59 knots with the flaps extended. It also must have a max cruise speed of 250 knots or less. And the aircraft can now have up to 4 seats if it's an airplane. All other aircraft have to be 2 seats or less. Aircraft in the restricted category are aircraft that aren't typically allowed to fly over densely populated areas. These are usually crop dusters and fire support aircraft. And the reason these are called restricted is because they're basically restricted on where they can fly. Now, as you saw, there are a couple other ones, but those aren't really important to you right now. So let's move on and talk about the aircraft documents that you need to have on board the aircraft when you go fly. I want to reiterate that all these documents that we're about to discuss need to be in the airplane. They can't just be in the hangar where you keep the plane. And to remember these documents, I like to use the acronym AERO. For the first two items, you'll find these requirements in FAR 91203. Now, as you can see here, the A in the arrow stands for Airworthiness Certificate. What the heck is an airworthiness certificate? This basically just tells the world that you didn't just weld a bunch of crap together and make something that's going to fall out of the sky when it breaks apart. This document basically says that the FAA has approved this design and it's certified in these categories over here. As you can see, this airplane is certified in the normal and utility category. It's not certified in the acrobatic category. So aerobatics are out of the question because it will probably break in half if you try to do an Immelman or some other crazy maneuver. Anyway, one other thing I want to mention about the airworthiness certificate is that it doesn't have an expiration date. Now, just because the aircraft has an airworthiness certificate, that doesn't make it airworthy. If you start making illegal changes to the airplane or don't maintain it in the way that's legally required to be maintained, it's no longer airworthy. But that's a lesson for another day. Next, we have the registration. This is just like the registration on a car. You buy an airplane and you get it registered. And that just tells the FAA and everyone else out there who owns the aircraft. That way, if you do something stupid, anyone can look up your IN number and tattle on you. And there are good things about this as well. If you were to crash your plane or something and they knew the tail number, they at least would have a starting point on who to contact. Okay, so the registration on an aircraft does expire, and it lasts 84 calendar months or 7 years after the previous expiration date. So, if the previous registration expired in November, the next registration will expire on the last day of November 7 years from then. Now, for the next R in our AERO acronym, that doesn't really apply here in the US, but if you're overseas somewhere, you typically need a radio operator's license. The O in our AERO acronym stands for operating limits, and you'll find this requirement in FAR 91.9. As you can see here, we must comply with the operating limits of our aircraft, and there are two things we need to have to help us to do that. First, there must be a current and approved airplane or rotorcraft flight manual on board if there was one made for the aircraft. I like to call this the POH or Pilot's Operating Handbook. If there wasn't a POH made for your aircraft, there has to be some kind of approved manual or placards or a combination of the two. Okay, one other thing I want to mention is that if you do fly an experimental or light sport aircraft, sometimes you'll find those operating limits attached to the airworthiness certificate. And a lot of times you'll find more details in there about what you can and can't do in those aircraft. Last but not least, we have to have our weight and balance. Now, technically this falls under the operating limits, so there isn't an actual regulation that specifically mentions the word weight and balance. But the FAA has made it clear in other publications that weight and balance is required when you're talking about those operating limits. I went into a lot more detail on this in my video on weight and balance, so if you haven't watched that video yet, be sure to check that one out. Hey, thanks for joining me today on Free Pilot Training. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider checking out freepilottraining.net, where you'll find all kinds of cool pilot gear and a ton of other resources that will help you on your journey to become a pilot. It also makes it possible for me to make videos just like this. And if you buy yourself a cool shirt like this one, it also lets your friends know that you're a pilot. We all know they need another reminder. In the next video, I'm going to go into more detail on basic med, because a lot of people going for their sport and private pilot certificate are telling me that there's a lot of questions about that on the written exam. So I'll put that video right here. Thanks for watching.
See ya!